Hey guys, so I've got a 60-minute game on the board, and my opponent is rated 798 in Rapid, so we're looking at pretty much 800. Okay, so in this game I'm going to be focusing on basic principles. Okay, move 2, my opponent plays a knight to the edge of the board, and that is very unusual. So the temptation is to move my d-pawn and then think about grabbing that pawn and giving him these doubled isolated pawns on the h-file. But I don't want to move my d-pawn forward to d3 until I've got my light squared bishop out. So that's going to be my first move. I can then play d3, and then I've got ideas of actually capturing the pawn with my knight. And then knight into f7 with a fork on the queen and the rook. That's a possibility. Okay, so the queen has come to f6. It's now defending this pawn. So I'm thinking d3 makes sense. It gives me a nice pawn chain here, and then that opens up the possibility of bringing my dark squared bishop out to g5 with an attack on the queen. So let's go ahead and push that. These are all absolutely basic classic moves that you've seen hundreds of times. Alright, so one of the most fundamental tactical tools that you have to use in chess is counting attackers and defenders. So before my opponent moved g5, he should have thought, how many defenders will there be of that pawn when it moves to g5? And the answer is 1. Okay, one piece, which is a queen. I've got 2 pieces, so I've got a rook and a bishop. Sorry, a bishop and a knight. So I can now go ahead and capture the pawn. Also comes with a fork on the knight and the queen. The queen's going to have to move out of the way. And the queen cannot retreat on that file, and cannot go there or there, can't stay where she is. So there are now possibilities for me. So the queen's possible moves are these. Okay. Okay, so my opponent has moved his queen there to b6. Now there is an issue. First of all, the first thing I do when my opponent moves a piece is, what is that piece looking at now? Okay, where can that piece go? And I see that b2 is an undefended pawn. So I need to do something about that. Now, my possibilities are drop the bishop back to b3, which I quite like. I could drop this bishop all the way back to c1, which feels like a step backwards, or I could move my queen to c1, which feels a bit clunky. So I'm thinking on balance, bishop back to here. It's then protected itself by 2 pawns, and certainly puts paid to any ideas of this queen coming in there. The queen is also looking at f2, so I need to be a little bit careful about that, particularly seeing as the g-file is now semi-open, because he's given away, he's blundered his g-pawn. So I need to watch out for this rook coming across to g8 with a potential attack down there. Now, one thing I could then think about is maybe bring this knight out, bring my queen out and castle queenside. Okay, my opponent's now looking a little bit open in the middle of the board. I can have a little prod at a check there, but that will probably just result in either the bishop or the knight coming out to d7, or the knight coming out to c6. So, and that would undefend then the b2. So there's not much point. So this is one of those times where a beginner might make that move, and then say that happens, and the beginner then moves the piece back. So all you've achieved, well, you've 2 things. One is you've achieved letting your opponent bring their piece out into play, and secondly, you've given your opponent then the first move advantage, because you've moved twice, they've moved once. It's now their go, and it's now time for them to push their ideas. Okay, so I notice that this pawn is actually undefended now on d5. Now, if I were to take with the bishop, which is the obvious move, then I am leaving b2 undefended. I can also capture with the pawn if I choose. Thing is, if my opponent goes ahead and captures on e4 anyway, I can't recapture. I mean, I can recapture with my pawn, but it's going to mess up my pawn structure a little bit. I'm thinking that pawn structure is going to be compromised at some point. Another thing I notice is that this pawn is also undefended, so he's got two undefended pawns right in the middle of the board, which is very bad practice. So my thought is maybe capture e5 with the knight, and then if the pawn moves off d5, I've got a knight and a bishop looking at f7, although it is defended by one knight, but I can remove that knight. If you're with me so far. Okay, so the idea is capture the pawn, then let's say that pawn takes, I can grab that knight, he'll recapture with the bishop, and then I can come in maybe with a bishop, with check, force the king to move, leaving the king in the middle of the board. Option 2 is simply to take on d5, but that doesn't progress my attacking idea. I could start with capturing the knight as well, that's another possibility, but I think leaving the bishop there for the time being is a good idea because it's cutting off a couple of squares from the king. It's limiting my opponent's choices to a degree. So let's go ahead and grab that pawn with the knight. So I'm now actually two pawns in front in material. I would like to castle before too long. Okay, I've fallen into a fork. I don't think that's too bad. So one way to get out of it is simply to grab this knight. Then if he recaptures, then I can move my other piece out of the way. However, it is telling that I didn't consider that move. Okay, I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to grab the bishop, because then either the king or the rook is going to have to recapture, and then his king cannot castle. Okay, so let's look at the board. I haven't castled yet. His king side is wide open. This is not a comfortable position for any member of the royal family. I still need to be careful about b2. I'd like to come in and grab that. If I do queen f3 check and then take with the pawn, maybe that's a way forward. I'm two pawns ahead. He could block with the queen. No, he can't block with the queen because I just take and it's undefended. He can't block with the bishop for the same reason. Queen takes and he's back in check. So I don't think he has any blocks, and that means he's got to move. So that king's going to go to one of these squares. That's it really, isn't it? Yeah. So we've got four options. What I would like to see is the king moving to there, because that would let me capture this pawn for free, because it would come with check. Okay, that's not happened, and he's found a place where I don't have a follow-up check, so maybe now it's time to bring my knight out. Knight to c3 or knight to d2. So what I want you to be doing in every game, instead of just automatically playing the most obvious move, the most natural move, the first move that comes into your head, I want you to be thinking about, okay, what are my candidate moves? Okay, I've got knight there, I've got knight there, I've got knight there. I think knight to a3 has no merit at all, because it can't then come to here. It can't really come to there either. I'd like to think about castling. I could castle now, but I'm a little bit nervous about castling kingside because of these two semi-open files that black has. So I'm thinking maybe a queenside castle would be the way to go. Now, if I play knight c3 and he pushes d4, is that a problem? No, it's not at all, because I can then drop my knight into d5 with a beautiful fork on the king and the queen. So let's play that move and see if we can't encourage my opponent to fall into a pretty obvious trap. I think somebody's 800 rated, if they take their time, ought to be able to spot that trap and resist the temptation to push and kick the knight for no reason. It also blocks up the middle of the board to some degree, which is probably in his favour, if anything, to be honest. So actually, if this pawn doesn't even take, I can capture the pawn with the same fork. So what he really should be doing at this point is moving either his king or his queen. If he doesn't, then he's lost. Okay, he's taking some time, that is a good sign. But remember, he's playing a 60-minute game. He's started a 60-minute game, and if you play a 60-minute game, you should be intending to use 60 minutes to make your moves. The number of rapid games that I play that are lost within just a few minutes is quite remarkable. Okay, so now we have something to calculate. Okay, so he's attacking my queen with a rook. Rook's a fairly valuable piece. Now let's say, so we're going to run through this in our heads and figure out if it's worth doing. Knight takes pawn, I grab a pawn. Comes with a fork. That means the king has to move because there's no way for black to capture the knight. Okay, so I grab a pawn, king moves, I grab queen with my knight, he grabs queen with his rook, I capture rook, let's say he captures knight. Okay, so I've got a pawn and a queen and a rook, he's got a queen and a knight. I think that's a good deal, so I'm up an exchange and a pawn out of that, so that's getting me 3 more material points. Of course, material doesn't win you the game automatically. You can still lose a game even if you're like really ahead in material, if you get checkmated. So that's why we say king safety first all the time. Okay, king's got to move, and that king's got to be really careful not to move to this square, because once the knight takes, okay, there we go. Now, in between move. Okay, so we worked out that I could now take the queen. I take the queen, rook takes my queen, I grab the rook. Then I lose my knight. Okay, now, there's another alternative here, because I have a forcing move. I could capture the rook with my queen. Okay, the king has to recapture, because if the king moves to there, then king to e7 is checkmate. Oh no, it's not actually, king can go to there. But it's pretty close to checkmate. So is this better for me to grab the rook, king recaptures, then I get the queen, and then he recaptures with one of these pawns? Okay. Materially, I think it's the same as if I were to initiate, well, grab the queen next, for example. I've also got potentially another check. So let's say check there, he moves the pawn in the way, then I grab the rook, then I grab the queen. That's a possibility. Check, pawn in the way, there's no point checking with a knight. Okay, so I'm thinking that the difference is that if he takes my queen here, I will mess up my pawn structure slightly. Remember, I still have all my pawns on the board. So if I initiate the exchange and king goes there, so his king is now more in space, so his king is going to be on f8 instead of e8, and I haven't messed up my pawn structure here. So I'm thinking that it's okay at this point to change my plan, right? What I calculated on the last move is slightly different, because he's yeah, okay. Now I grab the queen, obviously. He's going to recapture with one of these pawns. I now have a choice which side to castle. Okay, so basically the situation is I'm up in exchange because I've got 2 rooks and he's got a rook and a knight, and we've both got a bishop. He's got doubled pawns here, so he's actually got 3 pawn islands. Right, he's got 1, 2, 3, and I've got all of my pawns still on their natural files. So I'm thinking f3 is going to be a natural looking move at some point, but first question is, do we need to castle? So I'm thinking, let's see if I castle this side. Then I've got ideas of my rook coming to e1, e3, and then one of these squares joining the battle. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm liking this bishop where it is. Do you remember earlier on when the queen was attacking b2, there was a threat against b2. I had options of dropping my dark square bishop back to c1, I could have moved my queen to c1, or my bishop to b3. I chose to move my bishop to b3, and now that is looking like quite a strong position for my bishop. It's on one of the long diagonals on the board, one of the longer ones. The only longer light squared one is all the way from h1 to a8. Okay, so it's controlling a nice number of squares here, including squares around the king, which is a good thing. Okay, so before I play f3, if I play f3, I'm thinking I want to swing this rook around. It's called a rook lift, and it's a very useful tactic at some point. In middle games particularly, you tend to see this. So if you need to get... A lot of beginners fail to make the most of the power of their rooks. You kind of leave the rooks on the back rank thinking that's the rook's job. Well, it's not necessarily the rook's job, because you can do this. You can lift your rook quite often to the third rank and then to the side, where it can join in an attack. Sometimes you may have pawns going up the board, you might have queens, knights, whatever. Okay, so he's paying attention to my bishop. I don't need to worry about that too much. If he takes and I recapture, then we are looking at very likely exchange of rooks. I can't really escape with that bishop because I can't go there, or there. And I'm thinking if I move to d5, then c6 is likely to follow, and then I'm going to have to move back because I can't be taken by a pawn. I'm going to have to move back to here. So there's not really any point in me initiating that kind of trade. Now, the other thing I need to think about is if, let's say, on my next go, I lift rook to e3, knight takes, I can't recapture with the a pawn. Because if this rook has gone to e3 and I capture with this pawn, then bang, the rook comes down with checkmate. Almost checkmate, because my rook would have to come back down, then he captures the rook and that is checkmate. The classic back rank trap, don't fall for it. So if the knight were to take this bishop now, that's okay. I mean, I can recapture with a2 now, and that doesn't really hurt me. But I can't if I've played that move. If I've played e3 and knight captures, I have to recapture with a c pawn. That then gives me a worse pawn structure because I've got double pawns on the b file there and there. So is that an issue? Maybe all I need to do now is to play a waiting move, something like maybe h3. So what I'm doing here is I'm giving my king an escape square on h2, so that if at any point the rook does drop down to the back rank, I'm not in checkmate at least. Okay. At the same time, that move takes away one of the squares from his bishop. He only has one bishop on the board, like me. It's a light squared bishop, like mine. So what I'm planning to do is to get my pawns all onto light squares, and then, you know, his bishop, look at all the squares it can't go to if my pawns are on light squares, right? That's a lot of the board really that's kind of out of bounds to that bishop. A lot of places it can't go. So it's limited only to these squares. That's why we talk about controlling the board. Okay, knight has captured. I'm happy to recapture with the a pawn, I think. A takes b3. Then if he wants to exchange, we can exchange. I'm up in material. I'm up 5 points. Okay. I think that's another beginner mistake, right? When you are down in material, it's not in your favour to trade off material, further material. Here's the way I like to think about it. You've got a fight in the schoolyard, okay? And you've got 5 boys on one side and 7 boys on the other side, okay? Now let's say, do you want to remove 2 boys from each side? It's 5 against 7. If you remove 2 boys from each team through exchanges, okay, it's going to be 3 against 5. And the difference is still only 2, but the magnitude of the difference is much greater. Okay, if you see how that works. So another problem for my opponent is that I now have rook to a8. Okay, this is pinning the bishop. So the bishop now cannot move anywhere on this diagonal because it would leave the king in check, and that would be an illegal move. The king also cannot get to the bishop to defend it in time, so he's going to lose his bishop and he's going to lose the game as a result. Because what my rook can then do is it can segment the board. And this is very important. So let's say, for example, my rook gets somehow to this square here. Okay, if my rook gets to that square and it's defended, and his king is still in this part of the board, okay, and let's say my rook is there, his king is stuck in that part of the board because it can't escape to any of these squares because my rook is defending all of those squares. So that's a very, very simple tactic that can really pay dividends in the end game. Okay, so rook across here, and it's now just time to start vacuuming up the pawns, and then maybe get a pawn promoted and go on to do a checkmate, being very careful to avoid stalemates. Okay, so now I've moved my rook to f5. That is making a force field here that king cannot get through. So this king cannot, right now, get to this side of the board unless he goes 1, 2... No, he can't even go through there. He has no way through, that king. Okay, he can't come to here. That's as far as he can get. That's not available, that's not available. None of these squares are available. So this king cannot get to this part of the board, right? So what that means for me is I can just happily shove my G or my H pawns steadily up the board. Okay, that suits me very well. He's offering up this pawn. That's now going to block his B pawn, and there's no way now he can stop this pawn from going on to promote. Okay, he can now grab my B pawn, but that's not a problem because I'm just going to have a queen. I've got a queen and a rook and a bunch more pawns. I know this isn't stalemate. Remember, his pawns can't move, so we've got to allow his king to move on every turn, or else it's stalemate. I'm going to grab this because it comes with check. I know that you can't have stalemate if you're in check, so why not? And let's see the squares he can go to that aren't in check. Okay, he's got a few, so that's not too bad. Right, the quickest and cleanest way to win, Queen A1 would leave him a square. I'm thinking, actually, I'm just going to let him move backwards and forwards, and I'm going to get a second queen. He would be quite justified in resigning at this point. Actually, having these pawns out of the way helps me to some extent because I could just get a quicker finish this way. Everything's defended. He's got these two squares, so I can just push on. He's got to go now to one of these, I think, because that's out of bounds. All the third rank is out of bounds. So I think if he goes to a5, I can bring my rook in with check. Oh, he can go back then. I think I might just sit tight and just keep pushing this pawn. You see how my kind of strategic priority in the game, what do I need to do to win at each point? And it changes. Okay, so right now, what I need to do to win is not stalemate my opponent. Okay, if we go into stalemate, then the points are going to be pretty much split. He's going to get like 7 or 8 points out of this. He can't go here. If I check in with the rook, he can only go there. And then queen to there would be mate. Let's think this through. Okay, rook a3. King can't go to any of these squares. So king must go to there. And then queen to there. He's in check. Oh no, he can take this pawn. Okay, so let's just press on. Can't have too many queens. So now I'm thinking queen, and then the same kind of pattern. Rook there, king there, queen to f8 will be mate. Okay. That's fine. He's still got a5. Let him go to a5. Now rook here, and now queen here. And that is checkmate. There we go. So there you go. There's a game against an opponent rated almost bang on 800 points. I hope that you've been able to see some of the basic errors that I've outlined for you. These are things that you need to make sure that you're not doing in your games. I did nothing spectacular or special or particularly deep in this game. What I did was I took my time. I've spent 17 minutes on my clock. My opponent's spent less than 10 of his. Okay, so I took my time. I talked about my moves, which is something that I do even when I'm not on video, right? So I find that when I talk to myself during play, that it helps me to list my candidate moves, to figure out what's going to happen if I make each of those options, and then to talk myself through the whole process, really. So that's something I really recommend that you can do for yourself. Yeah, like I say, there's nothing spectacular. Chess is very often about doing basic things and basic things right. Okay, so I hope there was nothing in the thought process that that I've talked through in this game that you're not capable of doing. Okay, so if you do that, if you use your time, take your time, consider all the options, consider defense and offense together. Okay, because remember, you can't win a game if you've lost it, right? So you've got to put king safety first. Think about controlling the board. Sometimes it's okay just to sit tight, let your opponent blunder, let your opponent make a mistake or an inaccuracy. And if you get to this situation at the end of the game when you are overwhelmingly on top, then you switch your strategy to do not do something stupid, do not stalemate. Okay? And that's it, and that is how to beat an 800 rated player. I'll see you next time.